If you're gearing up to launch a startup here in the US by 2026, I guarantee you've heard a million different statistics about your chances of making it. But look, there is a massive gap between the flashy success stories we constantly hear and the cold, hard data that's actually driving those outcomes. In this explainer, we're mapping out the real landscape of the US startup ecosystem. We're looking strictly at the numbers to give you a totally clear-eyed roadmap of what you're actually stepping into. We're going to tear down some seriously pervasive myths and look at what the data actually tells us about survival, failure, and the massive amounts of capital moving through the market right now.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The funding survival gap.
So, there's this incredibly common belief out there that the ultimate safety net for a new business is external capital. And honestly, the logic kind of makes sense, right? Like if you raise a ton of money from venture capitalists, you've got a longer runway, you can hire the best people, and so obviously you're much more likely to survive. But you know what? That assumption completely shatters when we test it against actual 5-year survival data. Get this. Companies that are entirely bootstrapped, meaning they're funded by the founders themselves and their own revenue, they have a 58% survival rate. Meanwhile, venture-backed companies, they sit at a mere 32%. Yeah, you heard that right. The heavily funded companies are actually failing at almost double the rate of the companies that just had to scrape by on their own cash flow.
And this right here brilliantly illustrates the supreme danger of the raise money first myth. It is just so incredibly tempting to view venture capital as a guarantee of long-term survival or, as the ultimate validation that your business model is great. But the data shows us a completely different story. Having all that external capital often forces a hyper-growth timeline. It pushes companies to scale prematurely, way before they've actually figured out their core mechanics. Meanwhile, bootstrapped founders, they are forced, simply by necessity, to build sustainable revenue-generating habits from literal day one. Look, capital is fuel, for sure, but if you pour it into an engine that hasn't been properly built yet, it doesn't guarantee you'll finish the race. It honestly often just guarantees a much faster, more spectacular explosion.
Moving right along to Section 2, unpacking true failure rates.
Now, to truly navigate this roadmap, we can't just look at one slice of the pie. We really need to guide ourselves through the often murky waters of startup statistics, because how you measure failure completely changes the map you're using. So hold on a second, just pause. Whenever someone throws a failure statistic at you, you have to ask this exact question. Wait, whose data are we actually looking at? Seriously, if you go online and search startup failure rates, you are going to get wildly conflicting numbers. You'll see articles claiming a 20% failure rate, and literally right next to them, articles claiming a 90% failure rate. How can both of those exist? Well, we have to reset our attention here and really contextualize exactly where these numbers are coming from.
Here is the contrast that clears up all the confusion. On the one side, we have data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The BLS tracks all new U.S. businesses, and according to their data, roughly 20 to 21% of all new U.S. businesses fail in year one. But remember, that includes everything from a local bakery to a boutique consulting firm. Now look at the other side of things. When we isolate the data specifically to VC-backed tech startups, we see a brutal 70 to 90% failure rate. These are entirely different realities operating in entirely different risk pools. So the crucial point is exactly what we're highlighting right here. Statistics vary depending on which population is counted. The sources disagree because they are measuring fundamentally different things. A local service business that's just optimizing for steady cash flow is playing a completely different game than a hyper-growth tech platform optimizing to dominate a global market. Neither statistic is wrong, they're just answering totally different questions about totally different populations.
What's really interesting here is this concept of the denominator. As a founder mapping out your path to 2026, understanding your denominator is absolutely vital. If you are building a venture-backed tech startup, you cannot anchor your expectations to that BLS data that says you only have a 20% chance of failing in year one. No way! You have to look at the 70 to 90% failure rate of your specific denominator. Setting accurate expectations based on your specific population of peers dictates how you plan for risk, how you hire, and frankly, how you manage your own stress. If you use the wrong denominator, you're essentially reading a map for the wrong continent.
Which brings us to Section 3, why founders still build.
So you might be wondering, if the odds for venture-backed tech startups are so punishing, with up to 90% failure rates and massive 5-year survival gaps, why on earth does anyone do it? Well, $425 billion. That is the sheer volume of capital that hit the global venture capital market in 2025. That is a staggering, almost incomprehensible amount of money actively looking for ideas to fund.
It's basically a historic aggregation of resources specifically dedicated to backing founders who are willing to take on those 90% failure odds just to build something massive.
And within that massive ecosystem, certain sectors are capturing incredible concentrations of wealth. AI startups alone captured $97 billion of that funding pie in 2025. Think about that for a second. Nearly $100 billion funneled into a single specialized technological category in just 1 year. It really shows that when the market believes a foundational shift is happening, the capital deployed to back those specific bets is absolutely unprecedented.
And you know what? Founders are responding in kind. Over 50 million new startups launch worldwide every single year. 50 million! Despite the harsh odds, despite the brutal failure rates in tech, the relentless global ambition to build, to create, and to capture a piece of that market opportunity, it just doesn't slow down.
Synthesizing these massive statistics really reinforces exactly why the potential upside continues to draw so many founders into the arena. Yes, the likelihood of a tech startup failing is between 70 and 90%. And yes, venture backing statistically lowers your 5-year survival rate compared to bootstrapping. But the pure gravitational pull of a $425 billion capital pool, heavily concentrated in frontier tech like AI, combined with the collective ambition of 50 million annual attempts, it creates an ecosystem where the rewards for being in the surviving 10% are, quite literally, world-changing.
All of this data leads us directly back to you. The capital is there, the ambition's there, the failure rates are well documented, but honestly, none of those macro statistics matter if your specific individual business cannot sustain itself. When you take your concept out of your head and put it into the hands of real, paying customers, will your idea survive contact with the market?
Because understanding the landscape is really just the beginning. The numbers tell us the reality of the odds, but they don't actually tell us why those startups fail. In part 2 of this explainer, we're covering the #1 root cause of failure and exactly how to validate your idea before you spend a single dollar building it. You definitely won't want to miss it.
Welcome back to the Explainer. So today we're tackling that multi-million-dollar cliffhanger we left you with in part 1. What actually causes a startup to just flatline? Well, to figure that out, we're going to look at a crucial concept called validation before building.
You know, if you were to walk down the street in Silicon Valley, or really just ask almost any early-stage founder right now, you'd find they're living with this constant, low-level dread. Every morning they check their dashboards, they're obsessing over the burn rate, and deep down they're asking, what actually killed your startup? I mean, when the doors finally close and the servers get shut down, what's the real postmortem? The startup world is totally full of myths and legends about what takes a company down. But to actually survive, we've got to look past those myths and look straight at the hard data.
Just look at this number, 70%. It is just staggering. When you look at failed VC-backed companies across the US, a massive 70% of them say, we ran out of cash. That's the reason they went under. 70%. If you just skimmed the headlines or listened to surface-level founder stories, you'd logically think cash is the ultimate predator, right? Like, the secret to survival is just raising more and more money because, hey, the well went dry. But in the world of data analysis, we have to be super careful to distinguish between what people think happened and what actually caused it. And this right here really hits the nail on the head. You've got your symptom, out of cash, but the root cause, no product market fit. It's exactly like having a terrible fever. If you go to the doctor and your temperature is spiking to 104, that fever is a symptom, right? It's telling you you're sick, it's making you miserable, and it's what ultimately sends you to the hospital. But the fever isn't the actual virus. For a startup, running out of money is that fever. It's the painful symptom that forces you to shut down. But the actual virus, the underlying disease that is silently killing your business from the inside out, is a total lack of product market fit.
To really prove this, let's look at the actual diagnostic data. Here we have a breakdown from CB Insights, who did this exhaustive analysis on startup failures. And look at this. The leading root cause, destroying an astonishing 43% of startups, is poor product market fit. So while 70% of founders might point to their empty bank accounts and say, we just ran out of capital, nearly half of those businesses actually died because they built something the market completely rejected. The money didn't just magically vanish into thin air. It was actively burned away trying to force a product onto a customer base that had literally zero interest in buying it. So here's the crucial takeaway. Running out of cash is almost always the downstream result of spending your precious time, energy, and resources building something nobody actually wants. Achieving product market fit just means developing a solution that actually satisfies a strong, genuine market demand. If you don't have that demand, man, you are essentially trying to push a boulder up a massive, steep hill. You can dump millions into marketing, you can hire the best sales team in the country, burn through your entire venture capital runway, but if the market doesn't fundamentally crave what you're selling, that cash will run out. The empty bank account is just the final fatal consequence of a mistake made way earlier.
Which brings us to a massive, screaming pattern interrupt. Stop. Seriously, don't build anything yet. If the #1 killer of startups is building something nobody wants, the logical defense mechanism is to figure out what people do want before you build it. It sounds painfully obvious, right? But thousands of brilliant founders ignore this every single year. They get this light bulb moment in the shower, get super hyped, pop open their laptops, and immediately start writing code or manufacturing prototypes. They spend months in a vacuum, totally convinced of their own genius. You absolutely have to fight that urge. You need to hit the brakes before writing a single line of code or spending a dime on development.
Okay, so how do we actually pull this off? Let's dive into the validation playbook. Step 1, you've got to get out of the building. Metaphorically or literally, just go talk to real potential customers. You need to uncover their actual pain points, not the ones you just assume they have. Step 2, build a basic landing page to test actual market demand. Honestly, you don't need a finished product to see if someone's going to click a buy now or learn more button. You just need to present the value proposition and measure the reaction. And step 3, iterate rapidly based on what you learn. This whole sequence is really just about designing lightweight, super inexpensive experiments to see if the market actually cares. To survive in 2026, you've got to treat relentless customer feedback and rapid iteration as your absolute core practices. The ultimate goal here is to let the market dictate the product. You aren't this lone genius dictating terms to the consumer anymore. You're a detective. You're gathering clues and letting the market tell you exactly what it's willing to pay for. And yeah, that means swallowing your pride when a potential customer tells you your idea is terrible. It means pivoting fast, without hesitation, and completely letting go of your initial assumptions. This isn't just some nice-to-have strategy. As the data shows, it's the literal antidote to the virus that kills 43% of all new companies. Now let's look at the payoff and see how this builds your business in a truly tangible way. If you're sitting there thinking, all this validation is just going to slow me down, consider this number, 40%. Startups that prioritize this rigorous early validation process actually achieve a staggering 40% faster user acquisition. Let that sink in for a second. By taking the time to validate before you build, by holding off on the code until you are completely certain of the market demand, you aren't delaying your success. You're actually accelerating it. You acquire users 40% faster because when you finally do launch the product, it fits perfectly into a hole in the market that you already know exists. You're not just guessing in the dark anymore.
It's the ultimate startup paradox, isn't it? You've got to slow down to speed up. And understanding that sets us up perfectly for the next step in our roadmap. In part 3 of this explainer, we're going to dive into the critical team and funding decisions that make or break a startup in its very first year. Because look, we figured out what to build. Now we need to figure out who's going to build it and exactly how we'll pay them. But before we move on to that next part, I want you to look at your current project. Look at your code base right now and ask yourself a really hard, honest question. Are you actually building a validated business, or are you just funding a really expensive hobby?